Good evening and welcome to a special edition of Tracking the Tropics. I'm meteorologist Wes Hohenstein in Raleigh, North Carolina. Hurricane Delta back over water tonight and back down to a Category 1 hurricane. But that's not the end of the story, as re-strengthening and a second landfall on the Gulf Coast of the United States is expected later this week. This morning, Hurricane Delta made landfall in Mexico as a Category 2 storm with 110-mile-per-hour winds about 6:30 a.m. Eastern Time. It made landfall near Puerto Morales, which is just south of Cancun, along the northeastern coast of the Yucatan Peninsula. Delta had increased in strength by 80 miles per hour in just 24 hours, and its top winds peaked at 145 miles per hour before it weakened as it neared shore yesterday. State tourism officials said more than 40,000 tourists were in the resort areas, which, if you think about it, is a lot, but it's just a fraction of what it normally would be. Of course, we're still dealing with a pandemic and some of us getting ready for a hurricane. Now, the second act for this hurricane will involve the United States. And tonight, we've got a team of meteorologists to help you find out what exactly you need to know as this storm heads through the Gulf of Mexico. Let's start, though, with the latest from the National Hurricane Center. And boy, those are some amazing pictures. Here it is. We'll start off with the eye test. There's Cancun, Cozumel, Puerto Morales is right in between. That's where it made landfall earlier this morning. Didn't spend a whole lot of time over land, but now it's back over the Gulf of Mexico, which, as we know, even though it's October, is still got some very warm water, which will allow this thing to re-strengthen. So I hate to re-emphasize the fact that it is weakened and is just a Category 1 hurricane, because a major hurricane landfall is still possible later this week for our friends in Louisiana. I showed you this camera last night if you were with us on Tracking the Tropics. It was before the storm arrived. This is what at one of the Royal Resorts in Cancun, Mexico. I've been kind of keeping an eye on it throughout the day, both this morning, throughout the afternoon, and this evening. I know the sun is down, so you can't see much. The ocean is off in the distance. What you can see is they have power. So while they did take a major hit from a Category 2 hurricane, they survived for the most part. There was some damage, and we'll still figure that out in the coming days. But I also actually saw people in the pool this afternoon. And again, they had a Category 2 hurricane right around sunrise this morning. So life will very quickly return to normal. Remember, it's a resort area, heavily dependent on tourists and tourist dollars, so those areas usually get back up and running very fast. And tonight, the men and women of the U.S. Air Force are still working hard. We've got 2 Hurricane Hunter aircraft out there right now. I know it looks like a kind of a jumbled mess of lines. Of course, there's the storm out there in the southern Gulf of Mexico. We've got one that is headed back to base in Florida. That's the one that's been penetrating the eye of the storm. The second one still out there has kind of been flying along the outskirts of the northern Gulf of Mexico, measuring the atmosphere. All of this getting fed into the hands of forecasters and computer models. The more information we can gather both from around and inside the storm, the better job we can do at figuring out where exactly this is going to go and how strong it's going to be when it gets there. And the Hurricane Hunters will pretty much continue non-stop flights until landfall sometime on Friday. And today is only Wednesday, so they got a long way to go. We just got the 8 o'clock update in from the National Hurricane Center. Winds are back up to 90 miles per hour, gusting to 105. Remember, made landfall, then weakened. It was down to 85-mile-per-hour winds at 5 o'clock. And at this point, we get updates on the current conditions every 3 hours. So the 8 o'clock Eastern time update up to 90 miles per hour, gusting to 105. And again, it's a good looking storm. It's round, it's symmetrical. There's not a lot around it to give it any resistance, which is bad news for our friends in the Gulf Coast. Here's the latest track. It is expected to re-strengthen to a Category 2 and eventually a Category 3 storm as it slowly moves north to the Gulf of Mexico. It's kind of making a wide turn, almost like an 18-wheeler would. It's not making a straight northerly beeline for the Louisiana coast. So our friends in southeast Texas will be very nervous until it moves back to the northeast, which is the forecast expectations. Sometime Friday afternoon or Friday night, making landfall as a Category 2, but still a 105-mile-per-hour storm, very similar to the conditions that they just had in Cancun. So after landfall, it will weaken and then spread some rain across the Tennessee Valley and into parts of the East Coast. So here's a close-up look at the track. Again, here's the line of the path it took right over the Yucatan Peninsula. Expected to become a Category 3 hurricane early on Friday morning, late Thursday, early Friday, and then hold that Category 3 status through about lunchtime Friday, and then weaken a little. We're going to talk about why in just a second before landfall again sometime Friday late afternoon or early evening, right about the same place that some of our past storms have already made landfall this year. So it's just been a horrible year for our friends in Louisiana. And then again, weakening, moving through Louisiana and Mississippi, spreading rain through Nashville up through Kentucky as we head into this weekend. So this storm is going to impact a lot of people. So we've got a lot to talk about. Let's bring in our first guest tonight. Meteorologist John Conway has been with us a few times throughout the year so far on Tracking the Tropics, and he's with us tonight in Mississippi. John, one of the things we just talked about is the possibility of this storm weakening right before it makes landfall. A lot of times we see storms strengthening right before landfall, and I know we're not great at intensity forecast. Everyone knows that. Why this time around might we see some weakening before landfall?
Well, one of the things we look at is the shear profile in the Gulf of Mexico where the storm is going to be tracking. As Wes, you mentioned earlier, we have nice robust convection all the way around the center of the storm. But we're going to talk a little bit about the way the shear is shaping up over the Gulf of Mexico right now. And when we talk about shear, we want to kind of just bring everyone in. What is this shear and why do we talk about it a lot? We talk about it in severe weather forecasting as well. Well, wind shear is just a difference in wind speed and or direction over some sort of a distance. Now, when we're talking about severe weather over land, strong shear supports severe thunderstorms, weak shear hurts or weakens severe thunderstorms. But when we're talking about tropical storms, which are a totally different type of storm, shear works the opposite way. Strong shear hurts storms and weak shear supports them and helps them continue to develop. So we're going to look at a couple of the computer models that are looking at this area over the next couple of days. This first model we're going to look at is called the ECWF, the European Center for Mesoscale Weather Forecasting. We often call it the Euro model. Now, what we're looking at here on the legend, where you see the blue colors over toward the black, that's where we see strong shear, and where we see the warmer colors, these greens, yellows, reds, even into these magentas, that's where the shear is weak, and that's where the shear conditions will support development. Here is Delta right now, just north of the Mexican state of Yucatan. We're going to slowly move this forward right now, and as we continue to watch the track of the storm as it makes its way through the Gulf of Mexico, forecast to become a Category 2, Category 3 storm. Out ahead of it, what we're seeing here are kind of moderate conditions for development here. Out ahead of the storm, we see these little bits of green, little bits of yellow. That's where the shear is not very weak, but the shear not very strong. So this is one of the factors that could possibly limit it from strengthening too much, not like we saw with Laura, which was a Category 4 hurricane when it made landfall. It looked like in a very similar area to where Delta may make landfall as well. And one of the other models we look at too, GFS, this is one of our American models, another long-term model, long-range model, as well as we continue to look at the shear profiles that this model is forecasting out ahead of Delta. Again, we're seeing not the greatest shear profiles out of ahead of it. We're seeing these kind of cyan colors, a little bit of green in there, which means the shear conditions are not terrible for development, but they're also not the greatest. So this, fortunately, may be one factor as the storm approaches the Gulf of the northern Gulf Coast in Louisiana, may possibly limit it from strengthening so rapidly like Laura did just a few hours before it made landfall out here near Lake Charles, Louisiana.
So, John, that's a great explanation of what's going on above the storm, essentially, up high in the atmosphere. But let's talk about some of these past storms that have hit around Louisiana. They may have actually welled up some cooler water, and the sea surface temperatures could play a big role in what happens the storm before landfall, too.
Yeah, let's take a look at the history of the storms that have happened here in the Gulf of Mexico already this year. These are the tropical storms that have hit the Gulf Coast in 2020. Quite a few storms. We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 already that have hit the Gulf of Mexico, and a lot of them have been right in this area between the Houston-Galveston area, right over toward the Pensacola area in Florida, including that was Major Hurricane Laura. Now, we're going to talk about sea surface temperatures right now. One of the things we want to talk about with sea surface temperatures is that at. Our target is 26 degrees or 79 degrees Fahrenheit. If we see temperatures at or above this level, we are going to see enough energy in the water that it will support tropical storm and hurricane development. Now let's take a look at the sea surface temperatures right now. This is from buoys stationed out in the Gulf of Mexico. We see a lot of these buoys registering temperatures out in the central Gulf, 82.6 degrees Fahrenheit, 80.2 degrees Fahrenheit, 81. But notice right here along the Louisiana Gulf Coast, we see those temperatures just a few degrees down below that 79 degree Fahrenheit threshold. So that's why we think we're going to see some intensification to a major Category 3 hurricane out in this portion of the Gulf of Mexico, a couple hundred miles south of the Louisiana coast. But as it approaches the coast, we'll be needing to watch that very carefully, because remember, the shear conditions we just talked about are marginal up here by the coast, and looks like the sea surface temperatures too, not just because of the upwelling of cooler water from the numerous storms we've had that have moved through this area throughout 2020, but also the fact that we are starting now to get into the middle of fall. We're going to start to see those temperatures gradually watching. So we will be watching to see how these sea surface temperatures interact with the storm, especially in those critical hours before landfall.
Yeah, and that cooler water being aided by, the fact that it's October, John, and they've had some cold fronts make it all the way down there. So upwelling, we got some cold fronts. I mean, have you ever seen anything like this? We might have two major hurricanes or close to it within literally a few miles of each other in such a short amount of time. What we're going to see possibly when Delta makes landfall later this week.
Yeah, and my chief meteorologist a couple days ago were talking about that there were possibly two worst-case scenarios that could happen with this storm. One, of course, that it hits the major U.S. city and major port of New Orleans. The other one, that it hits southwestern Louisiana in the vicinity of Cameron Parish, which saw the devastating effects of Laura. Unfortunately, given the current guidance here, and this is the forecast cone for Delta right here, if this holds up, we could be seeing, again, another potentially near-major hurricane in this same area. But the conditions much different than they were last year. Last year, we were talking about temperatures near 100 degrees across much of the south. But Wes, like you said, we had some pretty potent cold fronts that have kept our temperatures well below normal for the last couple of weeks down here on the Gulf Coast. So that's been helping to keep these temperatures on the cooler side. So fortunately, if we do see another direct effect in the Lake Charles area, Cameron Parish, hopefully we won't be seeing a storm anywhere near Laura's strength. Fingers crossed. We'll be keeping you updated, though, over the next several days.
Yeah, John, a lot of fingers being crossed, and it's hard to ignore the fact that so many people around the country right now are experiencing some amazing fall-like weather, and unfortunately Delta is going to come crash the party and ruin everything. As usual, John, excellent breakdown of the meteorology of what everyone should be keeping an eye on as Hurricane Delta makes its way up toward the Gulf Coast. John Conway, good enough to be with us on Tracking the Tropics tonight from Mississippi. John, we'll talk to you down the road.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me on.
All right, so let's talk about some of the impacts before we get to our next guest. One of the major things that they'll be watching very closely, the wind speed. That's how we rank these storms. The categories we talk about, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, they're based on wind speeds. Well, those winds will eventually be coming ashore. I want to talk about the wind forecast as Hurricane Delta approaches Louisiana later this week. So everything you see here in yellow are winds of 39 miles per hour and higher. And 39 miles per hour, let's say 40, those are tropical storm force winds. That magic number is also when we usually start to see trees come down onto houses, cars, and power lines. Power outages happen, so that's a very important number. So those winds will start to reach southeast Texas and southern Louisiana Friday morning. Friday is not going to be a pleasant day for our friends in Louisiana or southeast Texas. So on the current forecast track, here's where things go downhill. By lunchtime, the wind speeds will start to pick up to 60 miles per hour. That's what you see in orange, as the eye of the Category 3 expected storm will still be offshore Friday at noon. Let's stop it again Friday at 4 o'clock, which right now is the anticipated landfall for the eye of Hurricane Delta. But our friends from Beaumont, really all the way over to New Orleans, throughout that whole afternoon Friday are going to be experiencing at least tropical storm force winds. Those hurricane force winds reach right around late afternoon time from Cameron, where the last big hurricane made landfall just a short time ago, really all the way over to parts of Lafayette and maybe extending closer to Baton Rouge. Still into Friday night around dinner time, strong tropical storm to hurricane force winds. And then the storm picks up a little bit of speed as it continues to move inland. But Friday night at 10 o'clock, they're still getting tropical storm force winds in a good portion of southern Louisiana. So from the time they wake up Friday morning till the time they go to bed, they're going to have tropical storm force winds, and that's not even to mention some of the other bad things that are going to be happening. Let's talk about some of those other impacts. Let's bring in our second guest tonight. Meteorologist Ashley Gann is joining us from Alabama. Ashley, we've been down this road a few times already this year with hurricanes. Let's talk about some of the impacts. It sounds like we've already got watches and warnings along the Gulf Coast. This is just the start. Not only the wind, but rain headed their way.
Yeah, lots of rain, lots of wind, tropical alerts right now. There's a kind of colorful map on your screen. If you can see that, we have the tropical storm watches indicated in that lighter peach color, and the brighter pink are the hurricane watches. We generally start seeing the warnings develop about 24 to 48 hours in advance of the storm. The difference between the watch and the warning is basically the favorable conditions. A watch says, hey, all the ingredients are in place. Conditions are favorable for either hurricane or tropical storm type winds. The warning means the danger is more imminent. So hurricane alerts really confine more to the Louisiana coast, a very small portion of the East Texas coast all the way up to Beaumont, Texas, included in that hurricane watch right now. Then you get on the periphery, so Galveston, Texas to New Orleans, even up through Gulfport, Mississippi. That's where you're seeing those tropical storm watches, which means those winds could be up to tropical storm force in those areas. We're talking 30 to 40 mile per hour winds, with a hurricane force winds being more like 70, 80, maybe even up to 100 mile per hour winds, especially as Delta nears the coast. You've been showing the track there. And even though it may weaken slightly as it nears landfall, the winds are still going to precede the eye of that storm. So winds could be upwards of close to 100 miles per hour as this makes landfall late on Friday. So that's something that we're tracking closely.
We should also point out, Ashley, that these watches and warnings that are issued are also guidances for people to start their planning stages. People thinking about evacuating, boarding up windows, hunkering down, changing their school and work schedule. So these are very important, these watches and warnings. They don't really lend to the exact impacts we're going to have. We talked about the wind impacts. It's going to be a long day Friday with wind. How about the rain? It looks like they could see several inches of rain in Louisiana.
Yeah, 4.5 to maybe even 7 inches of rain in some spots. And a lot of this will be dictated on how fast the storm moves. As we've seen from Laura, which actually impacted Louisiana, to Sally, very different impacts upon landfall. And interestingly enough, both of them very different categories. Sally, a much weaker storm by definition than Laura, but Laura, a much faster moving storm. Therefore, the damage was not as great right along the coastline. What we'll see with Delta is a strong storm, but it will definitely dump some rainfall. And depending on the speed of that storm, that will determine exactly how much rain we're looking at. Right now, models have the rainfall projected to be heaviest from Alexandria, Louisiana, down towards Beaumont, Texas, and right along the Louisiana coast. 8 to 12 inches from places like Lake Charles to Jennings. And then as you start to move out Interstate 10 towards Baton Rouge, those rain chances or rainfall totals go down to about 2 inches. And then as you start to get to New Orleans, maybe about an inch, inch and a half of rain. As you move up in northeast Louisiana, Monroe, over towards Vicksburg, Mississippi, still around 4.5 to 5 inches. And then along the Mississippi Delta there, you could be looking at 3 to 4 inches as well. I know here in the Deep South, SEC football is king, and a lot of folks questioning what's going to happen for Saturday. And the verdict's still out right now in Oxford because Tuscaloosa does travel to Ole Miss to take on the Rebels, and it does look like right now it may be a little hit and miss. I personally think the rain will come very early in the day, and it should start to clear out by that 5 o'clock kickoff, but I think elsewhere most other ball games are going to be just fine. LSU game did get moved, though, to Missouri. But as far as futurecast totals look like across the state of Alabama, we're looking at 1/2 to an inch with you can see the axis of moisture there back to our west, with Shreveport upwards of 3 inches. And we could even see that rainfall totals extending up into Memphis close to 2 inches. Even Nashville getting a lot of rain from this system as well.
Yeah, one thing I want to talk about, Ashley, and hang tight with me, the computer models. You know, we talked at the top of the show about the Hurricane Hunter aircraft out there right now. They've been gathering an immense amount of information. And I don't know if you've noticed, but over the past couple of days as we've been tracking this storm, the cone of uncertainty hasn't moved a lot. You know, sometimes as we track these storms days and days out, we get shifts one way, shifts back the other. It's a little bit of a soap opera sometimes. But if you've thought about it, the track hasn't changed that much. We've had some really good forecasts. We've had some really good data. And I want to show you two examples of proof of that. Our two most significant models that we use in the meteorological community, the American model and the European model. John had talked about those briefly a few minutes ago, but I want to focus in on two different runs of those models for an exact time, Friday night at 7 o'clock. Now, usually these two models have some disagreement, and that's evident from the winter to the summer to hurricane season. But it's very interesting to note, and this has been the case for the last few days, how much in agreement these two different models are. In red, those are isobar lines from the American model, lines of constant pressure. And when you get a bullseye in those lines, that's either where the highest or lowest pressure is. In this case, we're talking the tropics, so we're talking low pressure, we're talking where the eye of the hurricane is going to be. And that red bullseye, again, is where the American model thinks the hurricane will be Friday at 7 o'clock. The yellow lines, the yellow isobars, the yellow bullseye is where Hurricane Delta is forecast to be according to the European model. Look how close those models are together. I'm making a big deal about it because agreement that close, that far out, doesn't happen a lot. What that tells us is we should have a lot of certainty and feel really good, unfortunately bad for Louisiana, but feel really good about saying, listen, this is a high likelihood of where the center of this storm is going to be Friday night at 7 o'clock. Furthermore, we have several other models, and we sometimes display them as this form, as several lines. The spaghetti plots is what a lot of people call them, but the consistency has been here as well. Look how consistently clustered these computer models are. Sure, there's one or two outliers going haywire. We won't pay attention to those, and we don't get to pick our favorite one here. We watch where the cluster and where the trends have been. The cluster continues to be very fine-tuned right over south central Louisiana, unfortunately, and they haven't had a lot of shifts back and forth. So that gives us a lot of confidence in where this storm is headed. And Ashley, I'll bring you back in. If that path continues, the southeastern part of Louisiana is going to have a lot of problem with storm surge. We've talked about the wind, we've talked about the rain. Let's jump into the storm surge situation.
Yeah, so Vermilion Bay, that's going to be kind of in the center of your screen there. That's where they could see upwards of 9 feet of water inundation. And what happens is being on the right side of the center of circulation, you get that water, the wind moving out of the south, that water gets pushed inland and it has nowhere to go. And so it just increases and elevates that surge height. So if you see on the map, the New Iberia, Franklin, those are all areas that need to be prepared because that red indicates 9+ feet of possible water inundation or surge height. But you'll notice as we kind of drift off from that east and west, the surge improves pretty quickly. So that's good news. If there is some good news with the surge, it looks like it will be very localized in this particular case. As you start to move out to Houma, Louisiana, or Thibodaux to your east, you're looking at 3 to 6 feet. And then west of New Iberia over towards Lake Charles, south of I-10 there, 6 to 9 feet. But something else I want to point out, and this was something interesting to note with Laura as well. This part of Louisiana, it's not very populated on the actual coast. This is very different than Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Florida. And the reason why is the Louisiana coast is very marshy and very swampy. Therefore, there's just not a lot of infrastructure. That's actually some good news because some of that swamp can absorb some of that water. So even when the surge heights go up, it doesn't always necessarily dictate destruction. Now, if this was 9 feet of water in coastal Texas or 9 feet of water on the panhandle of Florida, we would have a much different story that we would be talking about. But in this case, these are some pretty rural areas. You get into more populated areas 20 and 30 miles inland, like Lafayette or Baton Rouge or Lake Charles, which still will be impacted by some wind and rain. But the surge right there on the coast, we may be able to spare some damage just because of the limited infrastructure. Something to watch closely, though, surge heights, again, ranging anywhere between 3 to 9 feet. And it doesn't take much, one, to flood out cars, but then you talk about it doesn't take much water to get into your house, even 12 to 18 inches. I mean, that's going to do some damage in a home. So something to watch closely as we move into Friday for sure.
Storm surge, rain, high winds. It's a triple threat of problems for our friends in Louisiana. And Ashley, I'll get you out of here on this one. And I know I've come to you several times this year already for this. You have done so much research on the 2005 record season. Up behind me, I have the list of names we've gone through so far this year. We've gone through all the normal names through W, Alpha, Beta, Gamma, Delta. That's 25. In 2005, we had 28 named storms. We've got, what, 2 months, a month and a half to go in the season. Are we going to break that record? What do you foresee the next month and a half?
I'm just going to throw a dart at this one because no one really knows, but let's just say I would not be surprised if we tied 2005 and possibly set a new record here in 2020. And mainly because most of our storms this year, not only are we matching other seasons that have been active like 2005, but we're also naming these storms earlier and earlier in the season. I've actually lost count. You may have the number in front of you. How many storms are the first named storm of the season, historically speaking? I know, I think I stopped counting after 7 or 8, so we could be up to 10 named storms, but I know that Delta was one of those. It was the earliest named Delta storm in the Atlantic Basin. So I would not be surprised if we, at a minimum, tie that. We could see more because remember, hurricane season lasts until November the 30th. So we still have quite a bit of runway ahead of us before this season's completely over.
Yeah, and we should remind people, October isn't a no hurricane month. October is the third busiest on average, and we are only 1 week into October. Excellent stuff as usual. That's Ashley Gann down in Alabama for us tonight, continuing to keep an eye on Hurricane Delta on Tracking the Tropics. Ash, we'll talk to you down the road.
Thanks.
All right, so let's kind of go through this list before we wrap up tonight. Again, we have gone through 25 named storms, and to Ashley's point, there were numerous, and for a while I was keeping track of it. How many of the storms were we reporting on where we said this is the earliest forming H named storm, K named storm, M and N? We did it over and over again. So many records being broken so far this year. When Hurricane Delta makes landfall later this week on the coast of Louisiana, it will be the 10th named storm to make landfall in the continental United States this year. 10 of them, tropical storm or hurricane. As I mentioned, 25 named storms is where we are at this point. We are on our way to that record season of 2005 where we had 28 named storms. And because it continues to be a busy week, we are going to continue to track the tropics with you all week long. We want to thank you for spending part of your night with us tonight with Hurricane Delta. Not done with landfalls this week. We will be back here tomorrow. Same time, same place, tracking the tropics. For John, for Ashley, in Raleigh, North Carolina, I'm Wes Hohenstein. Have a good night.